Welcome back to the deep dive. We are taking the entire chaotic history of a literary giant, extracting the most profound insights, and turning it all into knowledge you can use.
And today, we are diving deep into the extraordinary, magnificent, and let's be honest, often feverish mind of Fyodor Dostoevsky.
He stands as one of the most foundational novelists in Russian and world literature, yet his biography,
Mm,
it reads less like an academic text and more like one of his own intense pathological novels.
it's absolutely true. I mean, our mission today is to connect the biographical suffering directly to the intellectual output.
Okay,
We're going to unpack the seismic forces that forged him, his turbulent life from a childhood exposed to the extremes of nobility and destitution, to standing before a firing squad fighting a crippling gambling addiction.
and show how those very experiences birthed his profound philosophical and religious themes.
Ex-
We've assembled a truly rich stack of sources for you, a deep collection of biographical notes, intense critical analysis, and thematic breakdowns that trace his career arc from poor folk all the way up to his sprawling final work, The Brothers Karamazov.
And we're searching for the crucial, painful connections between the man who suffered and the masterpieces he created.
When you really look at his story, Dostoevsky didn't just write intense literature, he lived it.
He is the man who endured a mock execution, spent 4 years shackled in Siberian hard labor, nearly destroyed his life at the roulette table.
And yet, through all that chaos, produced the foundational blueprints for existentialist literature. It's an incredible story of suffering transmuted into ultimate artistic truth.
And here's where the critical debate gets so fascinating and why this deep dive is so necessary.
You have these intellectual titans like Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn.
And Sigmund Freud, who ranked him second only to Shakespeare as a creative writer, they were absolutely obsessed with his work.
They saw a psychological realism that was, just unmatched.
But then you have a polar opposite reaction. Critics like Vladimir Nabokov, a fellow Russian literary giant, he just dismissed him.
Completely. He called him not a great writer, but rather a mediocre one, complaining about contrived plots and characters who were mere neurotics and lunatics.
So that tension genius or mediocrity prophet or psychologist, that's the central riddle we aim to solve.
We're going to explore why he inspires such ferocious devotion and such fierce dismissal. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's start at the very beginning and see how suffering was woven into his environment from birth.
The initial phase of Dostoevsky's life seems to be defined by this deep and early psychological tension.
It really is. It's privilege rubbing up against abject misery. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821.
And his father, Mikhail Dostoevsky, he was a military doctor.
Right, and he later achieved the rank of collegiate assessor, which was a huge deal because it elevated the family to the legal status of the nobility.
And that allowed him to buy the Daravoy estate, where the family would spend their summers. So they definitely had access to the upper echelons of society.
They did, but the immediate environment of his early childhood was this stark contrast. The family lived on the grounds of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor.
Which was in a lower-class district right on the edge of Moscow.
Exactly. So young Fyodor would play in the hospital gardens, which meant that as a child with a noble title, he was constantly encountering patients and people at the very lowest end of the Russian social scale.
People marked by suffering, disease, poverty.
All of it. That contrast must have created an internal fracture from the start.
Absolutely. That duality of being of the nobility, but literally surrounded by the destitute.
You could see how it would fundamentally shape his worldview. It gave him a compassion for the marginalized that few other privileged writers of his time could have possibly possessed.
It was foundational, and if we look even further back, his lineage is complex too, isn't it?
Oh, very. His paternal line traces back to Aslan Chelyabinsk, a Tatar warlord who converted to Christianity way back in 1389.
And the family name, Dostoevsky, came from the village of Dostoyevsky.
So it's a family history marked by these huge shifts in faith and allegiance, which is, in a way, a reflection of Russia's own deeply complex identity.
And as for his immediate influence, his parents were key figures in his intellectual formation.
Absolutely. His mother, Maria, taught him to read using the Bible when he was only 4 years old.
That early, constant exposure to scripture and Christian morality must have been indelible.
It was, but his imagination wasn't just restricted to the sacred. His parents read nightly to the children, exposing him to this immense breadth of world literature.
Like what? What were they reading?
Everything. Russian classics like Pushkin, Schiller, Goethe, Cervantes, Homer. And then you have dark Gothic fiction like Anne Radcliffe.
Wow, that's a crucial mix.
It really is. He had the spiritual grandeur of the Bible and Homer, but also the psychological shadows of Gothic fiction. It created a mind naturally inclined to explore both the transcendent and the deeply shadowed realities of human pathology.
And this early reading also included Nikolai Gogol.
A key early influence, yes. Especially Gogol's focus on the ordinary Russian bureaucrat and the mundane tragedies of life.
But even beyond the books, there were two specific childhood incidents that later informed some of his darkest and most compassionate literary themes.
Yes, and we really need to discuss these traumas because they truly echo through his entire body of work.
Okay, let's start with the first one.
The first, which he likely encountered through his father's work as a doctor, involved the rape of a 9-year-old girl by a drunk man.
An incident of corrupted innocence and profound violation that he witnessed firsthand, or at least its immediate aftermath.
And that theme, the theme of a mature man's inappropriate or destructive desire for a young girl, it appears tragically and often disturbingly in his later works.
In Demons, the brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment.
It became one of his obsessions, the violation of the innocent.
And the second memory offers a psychological and spiritual counterpoint to that darkness.
It does. It's the story he recounted in his essay, The Peasant Marais. As a young boy, he was playing alone in the forest on the estate, and he became overwhelmed by fear.
He imagined he heard a wolf.
Right. And a serf named Marais, one of the family's lowest-ranking dependents, immediately sensed the child's distress.
And what did he do?
Marais, without any judgment, just comforted the terrified boy with a simple Christian gesture of compassion.
Why is that moment so vital?
Because that act, that simple, immediate compassion from a man at the absolute lowest social rank, it spoke volumes to Dostoevsky. It became the bedrock for his eventual belief in the inherent moral goodness and deep, untapped spirituality of the common Russian people.
The Pachava, or soil.
Exactly. The concept that would later define his entire political philosophy. It's the moment where suffering meets saintliness.
We see that clash of worlds continue with his formal education, too.
We do. His father sent him to the Nikolaev Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg in 1838.
Effectively forcing him toward a military career he clearly detested.
He absolutely loathed it. His friend, Konstantin Chertovsky, noted that Dostoevsky had less of a military bearing than literally any other student there.
He preferred drawing and architecture.
Over the demanded science, math, and military engineering, yes. He was solitary, he was critical of the institutional corruption, and this combination of reclusiveness and intense, almost severe religious interest.
It earned him the ironic nickname Monk Photius among his classmates.
It did. The seeds of the conflicted, isolated dreamer, the proto-underground man, are clearly being sown here.
But the real emotional turbulence began shortly before and during his institute years, marked by this rapid succession of deaths in his family.
Yes. His mother died of tuberculosis in 1837, which is what forced him and his brother Mikhail to St. Petersburg in the first place.
And then in 1839, his father died.
Officially, it was ruled an apoplectic stroke. But there was immediate troubling gossip. A neighbor accused the serfs of murder.
A story that Dostoevsky's brother seemed to perpetuate.
It was. That violence, whether it was real or just imagined, it must have been devastating.
And we also see the first physical manifestation of his lifelong ailment around this time.
Reports of Dostoevsky experiencing the first signs of epilepsy appeared around age 17, seemingly connected to the psychological trauma of his father's death.
And while the initial report is questioned by some biographers,
the connection between profound emotional shock and the onset of seizures gave him a literary framework for exploring these heightened, often pathological mental states.
That violence and chaos surrounding his father's death gave him a direct personal link to the theme of parricide, didn't it?
Which, of course, culminated in the great mystery of the brothers Karamazov.
He graduated in 1843 and briefly served as a lieutenant engineer, but he quickly decided against that life.
He lasted less than a year. He resigned and turned to translation to earn money, publishing his first translation, Balzac's Eugénie Grandet, in 1843.
But it wasn't successful enough.
Not at all. So he knew he had to write his own novel, something original.
And that original novel, Poor Folk in 1845, was an immediate, overwhelming triumph.
It was a sensational debut. It launched him overnight. He was an instant celebrity in St. Petersburg literary circles.
His friend, Dmitry Grigorovich, showed the manuscript to the massively influential critic, Vissarion Belinsky.
And Belinsky hailed it as Russia's first social novel. It's an epistolary novel focusing on two remote relatives, Makar Devushkin and Varvara Dobrosolova, who were suffering under humiliating poverty.
And what Belinsky immediately recognized was Dostoevsky's genius for psychological realism.
Right, showing how poverty didn't just cause physical suffering, but led to the loss of their inner freedom, to dependence on the social authorities, and to the extinction of their individuality.
So it's about the damage to the soul, not just the wallet.
Exactly. The seeds of the later, deeper psychological novels were being sown right there, using the framework of literary realism, but already pushing beyond it into the study of shame, dignity, and humiliation.
The success of Poor Folk threw Dostoevsky right into the St. Petersburg intelligentsia.
And his deep commitment to social concerns naturally led him into the political radicalism of the mid-1840s.
He saw the social injustice firsthand, both at the hospital and in his early novels.
So he was immediately drawn to utopian socialism. He devoured the writings of French thinkers like Fourier and Cabet, finding great appeal in their logic, their sense of justice, and their dedication to lifting up the destitute.
But this burgeoning radicalism created a powerful friction with the very man who championed him, Belinsky. What caused that ideological break?
The clash was profound and permanent. Dostoevsky's developing, fervent Russian Orthodox faith, it was completely incompatible with Belinsky's staunch atheism, rigid utilitarianism, and scientific materialism.
So Dostoevsky simply couldn't reconcile his belief in the spiritual truth of Christ with a purely rational, enlightenment-based worldview.
He realized the utopian socialists sought an answer in systems, while he was already seeking it in the soul.
And that realization leads him directly to the Petrashevsky Circle in 1846. What was the risk level of getting involved with a group like that?
Well, initially they were seen as more of a discussion club. They were focused on social reforms, like freedom from censorship and the abolition of serfdom.
Topics that were extremely touchy for the Tsarist regime, but maybe not immediately revolutionary.
Right. But Dostoevsky plunged deeper. He joined Nikolai Speshnev's secret revolutionary society within the circle.
A far more dangerous inner group.
Much more dangerous. He was fully aware of their potentially violent revolutionary aims, even if he confessed to harboring significant doubts about the morality or efficacy of their methods.
His characteristic internal conflict is present even in his radical phase. He's drawn to the intellectual idea of revolution, yet spiritually questioning the means.
And this internal struggle was then brutally externalized in 1849.
Yes. On April 23, 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested.
The Tsar at the time, Nicholas I, was terrified of revolution, especially after the Decembrist revolt and the 1848 revolutions sweeping across Europe.
And the charge against Dostoevsky was serious.
Very serious. Reading and circulating banned works critical of Tsarist Russia, specifically Belinsky's ferocious letter to Gogol. They were all held in the notorious Peter and Paul Fortress.
And this is where his life turns into pure drama, the sentence of death by firing squad.
They received the death sentence, and the Tsar made sure the execution was not immediate or private. The prisoners were taken to Semyonov Place on December 23, 1849.
Lined up, and the initial groups were led out.
Dostoevsky himself was the third man in the second row. He was minutes, perhaps literally seconds, from death. He reported later that the time felt limitless. Every sight, sound, and thought magnified into impossible clarity.
This mock execution is one of the most chilling acts of psychological cruelty in history. The reprieve must have been an absolute existential shock.
It was a deliberate, calculated act of psychological torture orchestrated by the Tsar himself.
Just as the first shots were about to be fired.
A cart arrived with a messenger commuting the sentence. Dostoevsky received his life back, but he never forgot the sensation of staring into that abyss, the instant recognition of the sanctity of every single living moment.
And this is the trauma that he immediately began to process and integrate into his art. Where did this experience surface most vividly?
In The Idiot. The novel's central character, Prince Mishkin, tells the story of a man who goes through that exact, terrifying experience.
Reprieved at the scaffold.
Exactly.
Right.
Dostoevsky used that narrative device to explore the profound philosophical and spiritual implications of having those final, intense moments granted back to you. It shaped his philosophy on mortality, suffering, and above all, faith.
It confirmed for him that the value of life lay not in rational ideology, but in the existential fact of being alive.
And instead of death, he received 4 years of Siberian prison camp, or katorga.
Brutal, crushing labor.
From 1850 to 1854 in Omsk, Siberia, he was considered one of the most dangerous convicts, which meant he was kept in constant shackles on his hands and feet until the day he was released.
And the sources give a truly horrifying picture of the living conditions. Can you describe them for us?
He described the barracks as having intolerable closeness. In winter, unendurable cold. He said the floors were completely rotten, the filth was often an inch thick.
Unimaginable.
They were packed like herrings in a barrel, plagued by fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. It wasn't just physical hardship, it was a constant, deliberate assault on dignity, body, and spirit.
So what psychological anchor could possibly sustain a brilliant, sensitive mind through 4 years of that hell?
His spiritual anchor became everything. The only reading material permitted to him during that time was the New Testament.
He received a copy from the Decembrist women in Tobolsk, right?
Yes, and inside each copy, they had tucked a 10-ruble banknote. His previously nascent Orthodox faith became his ultimate resource. The suffering, the forced solitude, and the constant focus on the Gospels solidified his spiritual trajectory away from political radicalism and toward a deeply personal, complex Christian belief.
And this experience became the raw material for his first great non-political work after his release.
The House of the Dead, published in 1861, it chronicled that time with astonishing journalistic detail.
It wasn't just a physical account of the horrors.
No, it was a deep psychological documentation of confinement, class divisions among prisoners, and the complexity of the criminal mind. It laid the foundation for his greatest novels, showing that the criminal was worthy of psychological and spiritual exploration, not just mere condemnation.
After the Crucible of Siberia, Dostoevsky spent 6 years of compulsory military service in Semipalatinsk.
From 1854 to 1859, yes. It was a necessary buffer before he could re-enter mainstream Russian society.
That time was essential for his transition, although his health continued to deteriorate.
His epileptic seizures became a serious problem, and he was finally released from service and granted permission to return to European Russia. It was in 1857, during this period, that he married his first wife, Maria Dmitrievna Isaeva.
And their relationship was marked by intense friction and distress.
Profoundly unhappy, yet intensely codependent, Maria struggled significantly to cope with his chronic seizures, and they often lived apart.
But Dostoevsky captured their strange bond perfectly.
He said, "Because of her strange, suspicious, and fantastic character, we were definitely not happy together, but we could not stop loving each other. And the more unhappy we were, the more attached to each other we became."
Wow. It speaks to the passionate, pathological nature of his relationships.
Upon returning to St. Petersburg, he immediately threw himself back into the literary world, co-founding the magazine Vremya, Time, and later Epoch with his brother Mikhail.
And this is the period when his political and philosophical outlook truly synthesized.
This is where he fully embraced the Petrashevsky philosophy derived from Pakshva, meaning soil or people.
A synthesis born from his exile and his Orthodox faith.
He fully rejected contemporary European movements like nihilism and materialism.
So how did Petrashevsky differ from traditional Slavophilisim?
Well, Slavophilism often idealized a romanticized pre-Petrine Russia. Petrashevsky was similar in its rejection of the West's purely rational paths, but it aimed for an open, modern state modeled on Peter the Great's Russia that would unify the educated class, the intelligentsia, with the common Russian people.
Dostoevsky truly believed Russia's unique salvation lay in this unification, rooted in its distinct Christian tradition and the moral instincts of the peasant class.
It's why his first trip to Europe in 1862, documented in Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, transformed him from a former socialist sympathizer into one of the West's fiercest critics.
The trip was a shock to his system.
A huge shock. He attacked capitalism, industrial materialism, and social modernization with ferocity. He saw London in its Crystal Palace.
That great symbol of industrial triumph.
Not as progress, but as a monument to soulless modern society, a place of hollow consumerism and the worship of emptiness. He was looking for the soul of the West and found only the mechanism of rational self-interest.
And tragically, that trip also cemented his greatest personal calamity. The gambling addiction.
Yes, he developed a crippling, debilitating habit, particularly in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, losing nearly all his money and constantly plunging his family into debt.
This personal chaos was a direct mirror of the psychological disorder he would explore in his characters.
The turbulence reached a peak in 1864. It was a catastrophic year.
His wife Maria died.
And shortly thereafter, his beloved brother Mikhail died. Suddenly, Dostoevsky was the sole supporter of his stepson Pasha and his deceased brother's family.
And the failure of his magazine, Epoch, meant his finances were completely ruined.
He was desperate, isolated, begging for money. This is the definition of the pressure cooker that yields genius.
It also created a literal ticking clock scenario that gave us one of his greatest novels.
He had to complete The Gambler in 26 days to satisfy an editor, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and avoid having all his future copyrights seized for 9 years.
The desperation was real.
And the necessity of meeting that impossible deadline brought the most important person in his life into the picture. A 20-year-old stenographer named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina.
She was the anchor who stabilized his artistic and personal chaos.
She was phenomenal. She helped him complete The Gambler on October 30th, 1866, managing his erratic pace and intense dictation.
And she recorded a fantastic physical description of him.
She did. Average height, light brown reddish hair, but one eye was striking dark brown, while the other had a pupil so large due to an injury that the color was obscured, giving him a mysterious appearance.
They married in 1867, but despite the love, the ensuing period was defined by severe financial hardship.
An extended, difficult honeymoon of over 4 years. The stress was continuous. Anna was constantly forced to sell valuables just to keep them afloat.
And Dostoevsky continued to gamble, despite promising her he would stop.
At one point, he forced Anna to pawn even her underwear just so they could eat.
The sheer psychological strain and humiliation. And this is from a writer who had just delivered Crime and Punishment.
Precisely. That level of personal chaos and desperation fed directly into the intensity and urgency of his prose.
And the cycle of creation and tragedy continued.
They had their first child, Sophia, in Geneva in 1868, and the baby died of pneumonia 3 months later. Dostoevsky wept and sobbed like a woman in despair.
This constant dance with death, debt, and devastating loss drove his most crucial creative period.
Let's track that output. Crime and Punishment in 1866 immediately drew at least 500 new subscribers to the Russian Messenger.
Then came The Idiot, written while they were fleeing creditors in Geneva and Florence.
Where he was explicitly trying to depict the positively good and beautiful man, Prince Myshkin.
An attempt that, while maybe not creating a purely utopian character, delivered a powerful commentary on how purity navigates a corrupt world.
And then Demons in 1871 was directly inspired by real-world political violence. The murder of one of its own members by the nihilist revolutionary group People's Vengeance.
So his personal chaos, the political chaos of Russia, and his financial chaos, they all converged to fuel this incredible engine of creation.
If we trace Dostoevsky's journey from socialist sympathizer to exiled prisoner to orthodox traditionalist, we see that his political philosophy was deeply rooted in his personal experience of suffering and spiritual conversion.
His early political views were certainly skeptical of Western imports.
Highly skeptical. Even before his arrest, he already found the idea of a Republican government in Russia ridiculous.
And post-exile, that skepticism evolved into firm opposition.
He viewed a constitution as merely a gentleman's rule, arguing it was wholly unrelated to Russia's distinct history and would simply enslave the people, benefiting only a small, educated elite.
So he rejected nihilism and Western liberalism, instead advocating for the native Russian soul through Petrashevsky. What did that Christian ideal look like in practice for society?
His social blueprint was essentially utopian and Christianized. He advocated social change through Christian action,
asserting that if everyone were actively, sincerely Christian,
not a single social question would come up. He saw political systems like democracy and oligarchy as inherently flawed because they only focused on specific class interests, leading to inevitable discord.
The ultimate goal was spiritual unity, not political maneuvering.
Precisely. Which also led him into supporting positions that are highly controversial today, particularly regarding war and imperialism.
It's a crucial, difficult point in his philosophy.
He was a vocal supporter of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, believing that war might paradoxically be necessary for Russia's spiritual and imperial salvation.
And he advocated the elimination of the Ottoman Empire, the restoration of the Byzantine Empire,
and the unification of Balkan Slavs with the Russian Empire, a form of pan-Slavism.
And this is why historians often critique his politics so severely.
Yes. Richard Pipes, for example, criticized his politics, describing them as going a little beyond xenophobia and crude jingoism.
But Pipes balanced this, didn't he?
He did. He acknowledged that Dostoevsky's lasting importance lay in his profound understanding of the psychological implications of radicalism. He understood the dark human motives that drove political fanaticism, even if his own political solutions were deeply nationalistic.
Let's turn now to his extraordinary thesis on the spiritual decay of civilization, outlined in Socialism and Christianity.
This is where he identifies three enormous world ideas. It is the intellectual engine room of his late work.
He argued that civilization had entered a second stage, marked by liberalism and a loss of true faith.
And he singled out Roman Catholicism as the first massive corrupting force.
Why such hostility toward Catholicism? He claimed it was not just religiously mistaken, but politically anti-Christian.
His claim was that Catholicism had abandoned Christ's spiritual message and instead continued the tradition of imperial Rome, focusing relentlessly on political and mundane affairs, seeking earthly authority.
And in his eyes, this made it inherently proto-socialist.
That's the great intellectual leap. By seeking external mandatory power and control, the church had forsaken spiritual freedom.
So how could he argue that socialism was the latest incarnation of the Catholic idea and its natural ally?
It connects to the concept of mandatory external control. The Catholic idea, as Dostoevsky saw it through the lens of figures like the Grand Inquisitor, sought to manage humanity, to take the burden of freedom away and provide worldly security.
The miracle, mystery, and authority.
In exchange for spiritual servitude. And socialism, in his view, just secularized that ambition. It sought to provide mandatory economic control and earthly happiness, the bread promised by the devil in the Gospels, removing the necessity of painful individual spiritual struggle.
So whether the authority was the Pope or the Politburo, the ultimate sin was the same, robbing man of his freedom to choose Christ or chaos or good or evil.
Exactly. Both systems prioritize the external mandated structure over the internal painful process of spiritual liberation. They're allies because they share the same fundamental flaw, a utopian belief that human happiness can be manufactured and enforced from above.
And his second enormous world idea, Protestantism, was equally doomed in his eyes.
He deemed it to be essentially self-contradictory. Having rejected the authority of Catholicism, he predicted it would ultimately lose its spiritual force, splintering into rationalism and secularism,
leaving only Russian Orthodoxy.
For Dostoevsky, Russian Orthodoxy was the one true repository of authentic Christian faith. It was untainted by the political legalism and rationalist decay of the West. He saw it as the ultimate unifying force for Russia,
providing genuine social answers through internal spiritual regeneration rather than external political manipulation.
And this intense faith brings us back to that powerful, defiant statement he made in an 1854 letter, the choice of belief over empirical truth.
It is perhaps his most quoted statement.
It encapsulates the emotional, existential, and deeply personal nature of his faith. He confessed to being a child of unbelief and doubt up to this moment, and I am certain that I shall remain so to the grave.
But then he offered the ultimate rejection of pure reason.
Even if someone were to prove to me that the truth lay outside Christ, I should choose to remain with Christ rather than with the truth. It is an intentional, defiant leap of faith against the cold logic of science, a theme that defines all of his major characters.
And he maintained a crucial connection with the common public through his journalism during this entire period.
A Writer's Diary from 1873 to 1881 was a huge success, a unique work, a monthly periodical of essays and short stories about society, religion, and politics.
And it remarkably sold more than twice as many copies as his novels,
which solidified his public profile. He was speaking directly to the people about the moral and political anxieties of the day. He was truly viewed as a public intellectual and increasingly a moral prophet.
When discussing Dostoevsky's legacy, we have to recognize that he didn't just write great stories. He pioneered a completely new way of writing them.
Blending psychological fiction, opinion journalism, Gothic melodrama, and satire.
And his core stylistic innovation, highlighted by the critic Mikhail Bakhtin, is the concept of polyphony.
This is key to understanding why his novels feel so alive and so modern.
So let's unpack polyphony. It's more than just multiple viewpoints, right?
Far more. Polyphony describes the simultaneous presence of multiple, fully realized, autonomous, narrative voices and perspectives, none of which is definitively judged or controlled by the author.
He presents characters like Ivan Karamazov, Raskolnikov, and Prince Myshkin, whose individual worldviews are so compelling, so logically consistent within themselves, that they stand on their own.
So the author isn't trying to deliver the final word. He's setting up a constant, eternal dialogue where the reader must choose sides, or perhaps realize no single side holds the monopoly on truth.
Exactly. Think of Raskolnikov's tormented internal arguments in Crime and Punishment, where his sophisticated theoretical justifications are constantly battling the simple Christian truth offered by Sonia.
Or the cool, calculating logic of the investigator, Porfiry Petrovich. Dostoevsky gives each voice equal weight. That dynamic, that constant, unresolved moral argument is the essence of polyphony.
And the style was perfectly suited to exploring his major themes: suicide, poverty, manipulation, the father-son relationship.
And the moral vacuum of a chaotic society. It begins, perhaps, with his most influential foundational text, Notes from Underground.
Published in 1864, this novella introduced the world to the underground man.
An unnamed 40-year-old civil servant living in a basement flat. This novella is split into a polemical essay and a narrative, and it's a direct attack on the optimism in the mid-19th century.
What exactly is the underground man railing against?
He is launching a cynical polemic against the modern human, specifically rejecting utilitarian rationalism, the idea that human actions can be predicted, controlled, and optimized by logic and science.
He attacks the Crystal Palace, not just the physical building Dostoevsky saw in London, but the utopian dream that 2 + 2 = 4 will solve all human misery.
His key idea, then, is the defiant assertion of irrationality.
He insists on man's freedom to choose, even if that choice is destructive, pathological, or utterly irrational.
He argues that man will reject any perfected utopian system just to prove he is not a mere piano key, that he retains the freedom to choose misery over enforced happiness.
It is unequivocally one of the first and most important works of existentialist literature, profoundly influencing thinkers and writers for a century to come.
Moving to his breakthrough, Crime and Punishment in 1866, this is the famous exploration of the extraordinary man theory.
The novel centers on Rodion Raskolnikov, the impoverished ex-student who theorizes that certain exceptional men like Napoleon are justified in committing crimes to achieve a higher goal.
He murders the unscrupulous pawnbroker to test this theory. But the novel's genius lies not in the murder itself, but in the devastating immediate aftermath.
The moment of the crime proves the theory utterly false.
It does. The core of the novel is the paralyzing, feverish mental anguish, the confusion, and the paranoia Raskolnikov faces after the act. His intellectual justifications immediately crumble under the weight of sheer human guilt.
He is physically and psychologically destroyed by the moral consequence.
Showing that even the most brilliantly formulated theory cannot override the inherent moral law encoded in the human soul.
Then we have The Idiot in 1869, his attempt to create a figure of pure virtue, Prince Myshkin.
Dostoevsky attempted the impossible, to depict the positively good and beautiful man, a Christ-like figure in contemporary society.
Prince Myshkin possesses pure Christian love and guilelessness, but the tragic irony is that in the egoistic, worldly society of St. Petersburg, his goodness is constantly mistaken for a lack of intelligence or idiocy.
The novel explores the heartbreaking moral consequences of placing spiritual purity within a world governed by greed, lust, and social maneuvering.
Demons in 1872 shifts gears into a dark, prophetic, political satire.
It is Dostoevsky's greatest onslaught on nihilism and radical political movements. It's an allegory demonstrating the catastrophic consequences when political and moral nihilism take hold.
The fictional town descends into chaos and violence,
Perfectly reflecting the dangers he saw inherent in revolutionary ideology divorced from moral or spiritual context. It predicted the violent, destructive nature of 20th century totalitarianism.
Finally, the magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov in 1880, the culmination of all his themes: faith, doubt, and parricide.
This novel is considered by many to be his ultimate achievement. It centers on the three Karamazov brothers, Alyosha the monk, Ivan the tortured intellectual, and Dmitri the sensual soldier, and the murder of their vile father, Fyodor.
It's essentially a grand philosophical debate wrapped inside a detective story.
And the most famous chapter is Ivan's parable, the Grand Inquisitor. This is where his critique of Catholicism and socialism comes to a head.
Absolutely. In Ivan's parable, Christ returns to Seville during the Inquisition and is imprisoned by a 90-year-old Catholic Grand Inquisitor.
And the Inquisitor explains to Christ that his gift of radical, agonizing freedom was too burdensome for mankind.
The Inquisitor, in essence, is arguing that humanity doesn't want spiritual truth. It wants security and happiness.
Precisely. The Inquisitor claims that by offering miracle, mystery, and authority, the Church has corrected Christ's flawed work by giving the people bread and security in exchange for their spiritual freedom.
It's a devastating critique. While Ivan delivers it, Dostoevsky is using this parable to warn against any ideology, Catholicism, socialism, communism, that seeks to provide universal happiness by sacrificing human freedom and spiritual truth.
It's why that chapter is so universally studied.
So if his works are this deep, this philosophically layered, why the astonishing critical divide? Let's revisit the admirers. Why were figures like James Joyce and Nietzsche so obsessed with him?
The admiration comes down to psychological honesty and stylistic innovation. Leo Tolstoy, despite their political differences, saw Dostoevsky's work as exalted religious art.
Albert Einstein called him a great religious writer.
And James Joyce claimed Dostoevsky created modern prose and that his explosive power shattered the Victorian novel because he dove into the pathological inner life that others avoided.
And the high praise from Nietzsche and Freud is a huge testament to his psychological acuity.
Nietzsche called him the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn, crediting him with providing insight into the unconscious drives and darker motives of human action that no academic had touched.
And Freud, ranking him second only to Shakespeare, called The Brothers Karamazov the most magnificent novel ever written.
Specifically because of its unflinching ability to delve into pathological, often unconscious human motivation, particularly the Oedipal conflict that drives the murder plot.
But then we face the Nabokov counterpoint. His dismissal was brutal. What were his specific charges?
Nabokov, who valued stylistic precision and aesthetic beauty above all else, found Dostoevsky lacking in all three. He called him not a great writer, but rather a mediocre one.
Complaining his books were populated entirely by neurotics and lunatics, that the plots were contrived, and his prose relied on glorified cliché.
For Nabokov, Dostoevsky sacrificed literary art for chaotic psychological drama.
That raises a fascinating question about the very definition of literary art. Was Dostoevsky genuinely sloppy, or was he just depicting an interior landscape that was inherently chaotic?
The Scottish critic Edwin Muir offered a strong defense. He argued that Dostoevsky's characters only seem pathological to the reader used to neat, well-adjusted figures.
In reality, Muir suggested they are only visualized more clearly than any figures in imaginative literature.
Dostoevsky was simply showing us the interior chaos, the constant unresolved polyphony that other novelists chose to ignore or smooth over. His genius lies in making the internal scream audible.
In the final years of his life, Dostoevsky achieved a level of fame and imperial recognition that was a remarkable reversal from his earlier exile.
By the late 1870s, he was an established cultural institution. Tsar Alexander II himself recognized his stature, ordering him to visit the palace and requesting his help in educating his sons.
An incredible sign of his official acceptance.
His crowning public triumph, though, was the Pushkin speech in 1880.
Tell us about the impact of that speech.
He was invited to speak at the unveiling of the Pushkin Memorial in Moscow. On June 8, Dostoevsky delivered an electrifying, emotionally overpowering speech, a masterpiece of oratory.
It was met with thunderous applause and tears from the audience.
Even his longtime literary and ideological rival, Ivan Turgenev, rushed to embrace him. One critic noted that Dostoevsky spoke with the tone of a prophet, seemingly unifying the educated and the common person in that single moment.
Sadly, that intense emotional effort likely accelerated his final decline.
It did. He had been diagnosed with early-stage pulmonary emphysema in 1879, and his health declined rapidly after the speech. He died on February 9, 1881, following a pulmonary hemorrhage.
And sources debate the specific trigger.
His wife Anna claimed it was triggered after he dropped a pen holder and strained himself, while others suggest heated disputes with his sister over an estate led to the fatal stress.
But his final message to his children perfectly encapsulated the spiritual journey of his life and work.
Before dying, he requested that the parable of the prodigal son be read aloud to his children. Biographers universally interpret this as his final legacy. The meaning of his life lay in the cycle of transgression, suffering, repentance, and eventual forgiveness.
His tombstone at Tikhtin Cemetery is inscribed with the poignant verse from John 12:24.
Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it dies, it bringeth forth much fruit.
The ultimate poetic symbol of his own life, dying in Siberia, only to be spiritually reborn and bring forth magnificent, enduring fruit.
His global legacy is truly undisputed. His books are translated into more than 170 languages. He is honored with museums, a minor planet, and metro stations in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Interestingly, the Moscow station is decorated with controversial murals depicting scenes from his works,
including images of suicides, a stark, final reflection of the darkness he insisted on exploring.
And despite his profound psychological depth, he was always wary of his works being transplanted into other media like theater or film.
He advised strongly against dramatization, arguing that each art corresponds to a series of poetic thoughts, so that one idea cannot be expressed in another non-corresponding form.
He felt that only single, isolated episodes should ever be dramatized.
Yet, despite his caution, his work has been adapted into iconic films and celebrated operas, like Prokofiev's The Gambler and Janotchka's powerful work from the House of the Dead.
So we've seen how Dostoevsky's own intense, almost pathological personal suffering, the mock execution, the epilepsy, the gambling, the immense debt, wasn't just background noise.
It was the necessary fuel that powered his greatest intellectual explorations of freedom, guilt, and faith,
He provided the psychological blueprint for the modern novel.
demonstrating that the most magnificent novel could delve deep into the pathological, the criminal, and the spiritual simultaneously, never offering the reader easy answers, but only profound, complex questions.
His unique perspective, born from his own dark night of the soul, still challenges you, the reader, to define the line between Raskolnikov's extraordinary man and the simple abiding power of the moral law.
We covered his deeply held, if sometimes controversial, political evolution, where he concluded that socialism was merely the latest incarnation of the Catholic idea.
Because both systems shared a fatal flaw, they were concerned with external, mandatory, earthly control, attempting to manage and perfect humanity rather than trusting in its spiritual freedom.
Which raises an important question for us today, as utopian ideas continue to circulate in various forms. If Dostoevsky saw a fundamental, inherent flaw in the pursuit of any utopian system, whether religious or political, what does that say about the ultimate limits of human collective ambition?
Perhaps the only true revolutionary space is exactly where he set his greatest works: the painful, complex, and ultimately free individual consciousness itself.